talk about indoor air quality, and really what we're talking about here is really enhanced air quality as well. And, we have found over the course of the last couple of years that, as they say, air quality really does matter. And here's some key points with regards to that. And really, if you think about it, in terms of indoor air quality, you're kind of limited to some of the things that you can do. You can dilute the air, or you can filter the air, and then you can try to mechanically or chemically or through some other means really clean the air in a manner of speaking. Some folks like to say disinfect, but that's kind of a questionable term sometimes, because you really can't achieve true disinfection. But so if we kind of talk about some of these things, you're looking at really what I just talked about was dilution, proper air exchange. Obviously, it can dispel odors, chemicals, and CO2, and reduce disease transmission. Other findings that are being proven now is that the right temperature can improve health as well as productivity, and that relative humidity really does play a large part in decreasing exposure to infectious particles and really, frankly, reduce viral transmission. So that 40 to 60 relative humidity is kind of the sweet spot. Of course, we live in the desert. Humidity seems to be an issue here. In the monsoons, it's too much, and during the rest of the year, it's not enough. A lot of mechanical systems don't have humidification here in this part of the country. But regardless, it's still good to know that can play a role in that. The other component, of course, is that air cleaning. And air cleaners can very effectively remove particles and recirculate clean indoor air and outdoor air as well. You can also use UV light to inactivate viral, bacterial, and fungal organisms, and even to a point disinfect surfaces depending on how that UV light is deployed. And then also pressure is important. So for example, if you have a hospital suite, or even, for example, a school, a nurse's office, you want to make sure that positive pressure control can help prevent and isolate infectious pathogens so that you're not either drawing in or expelling those things that might be in the air for that given space. So a couple of reasons why air quality matters, of course. And here's an interesting statistic during the pandemic was that 51% of the workers feared getting sick from being at work, and that would be a barrier to them returning. So it's still there. Of course, the pandemic is more endemic now, and of course, that's up for debate. But people still have some concerns. You see a lot of folks still walking around with masks. You see a lot of folks that are still very concerned about that, and really indoor air quality can make a difference both in folks' comfort in returning to work, being at work, and even overall transmissibility. So we kind of talked about dilution, temperature, humidity, filtration, of course, the UV light and pressure, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about maybe some solutions in that regard. So here's another interesting opinion survey. It's a 2020 building occupant survey. And it kind of shows, some of the concerns of folks through 2019, through present and into the future. And of course, we were looking at crowd management, people count, minimizing the maximum number of folks inside a space, and air quality, and then compliance with masks and then thermal detection and whatnot. And those really are all kind of waning and going away into a sense. You still have some spaces, of course, where they check your temperature coming in, et cetera. But really, crowd management, et cetera, has really kind of gone away. The survey indicates that air quality and air quality continue to be strong, and crowd management to a point as well, which is interesting. And frankly, I'm a little surprised by that. Air quality seemed to be a bigger component of at least the customers and folks that I talk to around the country. But kind of an interesting graph here. So, when we're talking about ASHRAE or indoor air quality and guidance, ASHRAE, of course, is not a governing body, but a very strong body in terms of their recommendations and design. And so if you look at ASHRAE recommendations, they really do kind of mirror what we've talked about in terms of even what Honeywell offers, and even other companies can offer as well, is you want to increase that outdoor ventilation. Of course, that's a challenge when it's very cold or very hot, but nonetheless, they continue to indicate that you want to increase that outdoor ventilation. Was recently out in Los Angeles, and the customer looked at us and said, well, these sites are located right next to the interstate and perhaps in industrial areas where you have petroleum refineries and whatnot. And how do we mitigate that effect? And he had a point in that if you bring in more outside air, well, is that outside air cleaner than what's inside? So you kind of have to be careful with that. And that's where some sensor and some intelligence comes into play in terms of that. But regardless, that is a recommendation that ASHRAE makes. The other one is improving central air filtration to MERV 13 or the highest compatibility with the filter rack. And that's important. The governor mandated that all schools have MERV 13 or higher filters. I know in particular with our service organization, that was not without its challenges because a lot of these air handlers cannot accommodate higher MERV rated filters or higher MERV rated filters. And even those places where it's kind of been shoehorned in, we're seeing some issues with decreased mechanical capabilities of cooling. You're seeing some diminished airflow, perhaps even impacting the refrigeration systems themselves in terms of them frosting up and whatnot because of that. So there's some other issues and other ways to mitigate that concern with specific in-room or systemic filtering that can be accomplished as well. And we can talk about that as well. Of course, they recommend keeping systems running longer, if possible, 24/7 to enhance the filtration and the ventilation. Of course, that comes at a cost because now you're running your equipment 24/7, and obviously that is an expensive proposition. And there are some solutions that can look at system mechanical performance and can look at outside air conditions, indoor air conditions. And then this is called demand ventilation and had some multimodal ventilation modes as well, in that the system can adapt to healthy environment, productivity environment, comfort, or even nighttime. And so using building automation systems and some of that intelligence can help mitigate some of those concerns in terms of increased energy use and running the systems 24/7, where the system itself can make the determination and say, hey, it's the indoor air quality has diminished. Let's look at what we're doing. It looks at flow, it looks at chill water flow, it looks at airflow. And then based on a lot of those parameters and indoor air sensor and outdoor air sensor, it makes those adjustments so that you're not having to run anything 24/7. Or if you are running it, it's not 100% of everything. So that also minimizes your energy consumption. Another recommendation is that use portable room air cleaners with Hepa filters. And that's a great solution in many places where either A, you don't have mechanical systems, or you just have smaller systems that cannot be easily adapted. And these Hepa filters are very effective. And I've got a little demonstration I'll show you later in terms of how those operate, because those filters really can reduce particulate matter and total volatile organic compounds. And we'll get into that as well in a little while. And then the other thing that they suggest is consider ultraviolet genocidal irradiation. And again, there's multiple ways that UV can be deployed. One of them is that you actually mount these in front of coils. The UV light inactivates all that, what I call gunk that grows inside coils and condensate pans. And it prevents that mold and bacteria and other things that are growing there from being propagated into the space. There's also ultraviolet germicidal irradiation of the actual airstream. And you can actually install a sufficient number of UV lights within that airstream that will actually inactivate the particles while the air is flowing. It can be done. It requires a large amount of UV lights, and it does require obviously power for those UV lights. But you certainly can do that for critical spaces where you want to make sure that you are impacting the transmissibility. These all tie into obviously Honeywell solutions, but in and of itself, these other solutions can be achieved as well, specific to the individual needs. So,
Julio, can I ask
yes.
a question? So, what about ozone? is that a problem in commercial buildings? I mean, people are somewhat aware of it for residential, and if I can, sidetrack you and ask you what could be done to analyze and mitigate that.
In terms of the ozone in the air itself?
Yeah, like I understand it's in the soil that a lot of the buildings are built in, and it comes into the building.
Right. You certainly can. There's not a lot that can be done in terms of filtration. At that point, that becomes more a dilution issue, in that you want to make sure you're bringing in fresh air, because ozone it decays naturally, but you certainly don't want to be generating more ozone. And certainly there are some of solutions that kind of came out here during the pandemic that did generate ozone. And obviously that's not something that you want to have your folks breathing. So it's a tough one. And dilution is one of the few things that you can really do to mitigate that, other than introducing it by other means. And yes, UV lights can generate ozone, but the solutions that we use, it's negligible and well within the safety limits.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So kind of looking at some safety guidelines. And when it talks about this is kind of interesting. It says acceptable IAQ refers to air in which there are no known contaminants at harmful concentrations. And so that's interesting, in that you want to make sure, what's acceptable, right? And so when you're looking at the various recommendations in terms of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, humidity, et cetera, particulates, and not to sound redundant, particulates in particular, it's very important to mitigate those, because that really, and I'll show you a little slide here in a little bit, really is conducive to the propagation of viruses in the air. So again, we talked about the ventilation recommendations. You want to keep the systems running 24/7, of course. Minimize the percentage of air recirculation, which ties, of course, back to the outside air, and optimize HVAC for higher exchange. The way to mitigate infectious aerosol risk is you want to look at those air distribution patterns. I spoke about differential room pressurization, personalized ventilation, which would be individual spaces or even filtration within that space. Source capital ventilation, which is, of course, is a centralized filtration, again, central or local, and temperature control and relative humidity. And those are, of course, challenges in any system that is, even in the most basic form, it's difficult to achieve relative humidity settings. And even on larger systems, again, most don't have a lot of humidification. Obviously, there are some buildings out there that do, but your average office building, average school is not going to have humidity control. Also, kind of did want to touch on total volatile organic compounds. And again, there's some different standards, but regardless, you want to minimize those TVOCs. And TVOCs are really, if you look at it, it's off-gassing of building materials, foams, paints, aerosols. Those all contribute to that total volatile organic compounds. And so it's important because those are irritants. So again, just a little background on what ASHRAE is considered and some of those parameters. So if you look at particulates in air composition, this is an interesting study that Harvard put out, in that this study connected COVID-19 deaths to poor indoor air quality. And it's really interesting in that, talking about, I apologize here, but it says, we found that an increase of only 1 microgram in particulate matter, 2.5, is associated with an 8% increase in the COVID death rate. And so this is really kind of what we're talking about here, is that particulate matter plays a very important role in the transmissibility, according to this study. And so, what they're saying is that there was an increase when the particulate matter, only 1 microgram per meter cube, and particulate matter 2.5 is very small. And I'll show you a little slide here that kind of talks about some of that in a little while. But coming back to filtration, and we'll touch on these specific topics, filtration being one of them that's important, obviously, is you want to reduce the recirculation risk. And of course, bringing in additional air can help. There are technologies out there that can help maximize that and optimize your energy performance. And intelligent economizer control is one of those that you can use to help with that ventilation. And at the same time, try to mitigate some of that increased energy cost associated with bringing in unconditioned air, such as when it's very hot or it's very cold. You want to make sure that your economizers are working properly if you have them. You got to make sure the damper controls are working properly. I can't tell you how many units I've ever seen in my career where the economizers just are often neglected or not work or bypassed completely or rusted shut. So that's important. You want to make sure that if you're responsible for that those economizers are working properly, and that you have the proper control so that you're mitigating the impact of outside air conditions. And then you also want to make sure that they're able to bring in that fresh outside air properly. So we talked about filtration and disinfection, and I don't like that word, frankly, in disinfection, because it is a tough thing to achieve. But when we're talking about air cleaners with the MERV 13 filter captures at least 50% of 0.3 micron particles, and MERV 14 captures 75%. If you look at UV as well, and I mentioned that earlier, is duct mounting UVC helps keeps those coils clean. And not only does it help keep the coils clean, obviously with drain pans and other wet surfaces that might be in there that are conducive to the growth of nasties, as I call it, really also helps reduce what's called biofilm. And biofilm is what grows on the coils. And there's actually a calculator that will show you the energy consumption of that biofilm. It seems negligible, but it does make the systems work harder. And so it's kind of a twofold, a twofer, if you will, in terms of benefit. It helps keep that stuff from growing and being propagated through the space, which is important. And then it also reduces energy consumption. So again, recommendations are implement media filters with MERV 13 or higher as applicable. Another option is electronic air cleaners. And electronic air cleaners are really neat technology. They provide the equivalent of MERV 13 or 14 filtration without the associated pressure drop. And those electronic air cleaners can also have UV light on them and help keep those collection plates clean. And so essentially what you can use is, if you use those electronic air cleaners, they take the place of your filter banks. You don't have all that trash that's being generated by the disposal of those filters, and those electronic air cleaner elements can really be taken out and washed and reused. And again, the big plus is that you don't have that pressure drop. And so if you have a filter that a MERV 13 mechanical filter and an electronic air cleaner that's rated MERV 13, you're not going to have that pressure drop, and your system's going to operate more efficiently because it's not having to overcome that pressure drop. And so that's an important consideration. And I have more information. Jessica can also provide more info if you all are interested in those EACs. This is kind of an eye chart here, but basically what they're talking about is really the standards for MERV filtration and where those applications might be appropriate to use those kinds of filters. So if you look at the MERV 13 to 16 rating, if you look at the average arrestance, how much the material actually captures, and the particle size, you can see that the particle range is 0.3 to 1 micrometer, which is really an efficient thing that you want, because it effectively will capture a large number of those particles that are floating through there that could be deleterious to people's health. So again, as I promised earlier, we're going to talk about particulate matter. And so really, particulate matter, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, you can see how small those are. When you're talking about beach sand, which is fine, is 90 micrometers. Human hair is 50 to 70 micrometers. Particulate matter is less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And so it's very, very small. And what happens is that those small particles defeat our body's natural filter defenses. They are so small that they literally penetrate into the alveoli of the lungs and can enter the bloodstream. And so what does PM 2.5 do? Well, it triggers an inflammatory response that can lead to oxidative damage and plaque formation in blood vessels. So that by itself is important, that you want to make sure that you're not breathing in those small compounds. But as that Harvard study showed, an increase in particulate matter could also signal an increase in transmissibility of disease. So it's important to know what's happening here. And particulate matter, the only way to eliminate this, if you will, is really through filtration. That there's no other way other than, again, pushing that out with increased ventilation. But again, that has limitations. So that's where filtration really is important. And you want to understand what you're up against, what that fight is, and why that filtration is important, and really why particulate matter is important in general health as well, not just disease transmission, but just breathing that stuff in is not good for you. So I kind of mentioned the electronic air cleaners, and this is kind of a picture of what these look like. Honeywell makes these, of course. Other manufacturers out there make them as well. These are really nice in that these are individual elements, and each element filters up to 2,000 CFM. So if you had a 10,000 CFM air handler, you would do the math. That means you need about 5 of those units. You bolt those together. They get installed in the air filter rack instead of the actual filters themselves. And now they're providing MERV 13 equivalent filtration without the associated MERV 13 pressure drop across the system. They can be wired to your building automation system to let you know that if they're dirty, if they require service. And again, they can be washed and reused. They do have a pre-filter, but the actual element itself can be washed and reused. And so, again, it really is nice in that it removes that particulate 2.5 matter very effectively and prevents that from being recirculated through the space. There are also single room media air cleaners in instances where you can't have system modifications to your HVAC systems or large modifications like that. You can actually install filtration units within the space itself. And again, the nice thing about it is that you're not having to modify your existing HVAC. And these are very effective in terms of that removal of particulate matter, and can also reduce total volatile organic compounds through filtration and odor elimination as well. So these are nice solutions as well. Again, these are Honeywell specific, but other manufacturers obviously can make these as well. But just looking at what some options are in terms of places where you say, wait, I can't make a system modification. We don't have the budget. And you have, a classroom, or you have meeting spaces or rooms that maybe are only served by rooftop package units. And you want to make sure that you're providing adequate filtration, and say those rooftop package units can't be retrofitted with MERV 13 filters for whatever reason. These kinds of filtration options are really slick in that you can install these without having to modify. They operate efficiently and can run continuously, can be integrated with your building automation system, or can run on a switch control locally as well, based on what's going on within that space and use.
Facility Managers Association.
I'm sorry, did somebody have a question?
Okay. Just off mute.
And then, of course, you also have multi-room media air cleaners that can be installed as part of the actual filtration of the main system. We kind of talked about portable oil filters as well, and these are really a nice solution. These particular ones cover about 460 square feet, and they are Hepa filters, and so that it captures up to 99.97 of allergens, 0.3 microns and larger. And so these do a very good job. They capture the particles, VOCs, and odors, and they don't require mechanical retrofits of the existing system. So if you have office spaces or areas, again, where you can't implement those other solutions, these do a very nice job. And again, other manufacturers make these. It's not just Honeywell that they're available from. And so kind of, how do these work? Obviously, it's through filtration. You have a carbon filter that captures the larger particles, VOCs and odors. And then you have a Hepa filter that captures, all those other smaller particles that are floating around, including mold and certain viruses and bacteria. So very effective solution as well.
And I want to testify. I have a unit that looks like that one you just showed, and I bought it like probably 3 years ago. And I have run it 24/7, just constantly. And it has not failed me. I change out the filters. It's been really a super dependable little personal unit. I mean, I'm astounded. I'm trying to run it till it fails, and it won't fail. So thank you guys. Thank you, Honeywell, for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, those are kind of bulletproof. They do a very good job. And here's a little animation you can see. The animation on the left-hand side is a room with a person, that sneezes and expels stuff, if you will. And if you look at that, you can kind of see how that propagates. And this is an actual animation of a simulation that was run through testing laboratories. And you can see how those particles propagate through the room. And so, sorry about that. Doing that. Let me play that again. You can see how those particles spread and propagate. Whereas if you look at the right-hand side, you have those portable air filters indicated by those black ovals. And as the particles are expelled by that person in yellow, you can see how they come out, but they're immediately captured. And so in terms of the effectiveness, very few of those particles escape to wreak havoc elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, a very effective use of those filters where you might not be able to implement larger scale systems. This is over the course of 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes. But regardless, you can still see the effectiveness of those individual units.
Is there for those portable filters? Is there a requirement in terms of if I have a lot of open space in a lot of my facilities, and so is there a requirement in terms of how far apart, if I purchase, let's say 5 or 6 of them, they should be?
Yeah. So what you would do is they cover about 460 square feet. And
right.
So you draw a radius of half of that.
Okay.
And then, and that would give you the approximate placement for those.
All right, great.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Reggie.
What's the list price on those things?
I think they're under $200. Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a pricing guy, but I think they're very cost effective.
Yeah, let me double check. I think the last, I was putting pricing together for a lot of the school districts that I work with. They were placing these in their classrooms. And so I know that at a time, a couple of months ago, Honeywell was doing, kind of like a deal where we want to be less than, let's say, Amazon or any other manufacturer who's providing these. So let me double check and see if I can get some pricing. And I'll email it out to everybody, maybe.
Yeah, Jessica, I would definitely be interested in that. Thanks. Hey, another question, and I don't know if you have this in your presentation or not, but do we have any information with negative pressure rooms as well? Is that something that you guys can speak to?
It's not in this presentation, but we do have products that can address that. So our Phoenix air controls are primarily designed for those instances and different applications. So maybe Jessica can have a one-off and provide you additional information.
Perfect. Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, let me move on. So the other component that we have to talk about is how do you know what you're doing? If you're not measuring what you're doing, are you really doing anything? And so this is really where indoor air quality sensors come into play. And there's couple of different solutions. Starting from the left, of course, your standard temperature, humidity. Most occupancies these days, that's pretty standard. You're monitoring temperature, humidity, and CO2 in some places, depending on larger occupancies. But then you also want to be looking at, as I indicated earlier, is particulate matter. That's important for the reasons that we've stated, and also total volatile organic compounds. And there are sensors that will discretely measure those individual components. And then we also make multi-detection technology that does have temperature.
Your iPad, Roy?
All right, thanks everybody. And you also have the multi-sensor.
Our 270-year-old Dutch barn is a grist mill.
All right.
Okay. So one more time. So these multi-sensors can measure temperature, relative humidity, CO2, particulate matter 2.510, and TVOCs. And they come in either a wall mount or duct mount, which can be integrated with your building management systems. Individually, if you wanted to, again, you can have those discrete particulate matter and TVOC sensors, and then working back temperature, humidity, and CO2. So just some options, but again, it's important to know what's going on, and these can be integrated with the majority of building automation systems. And then we talked about UV cleaning, and we'll get into a little bit more of that. But UV cleaning is important because of the fact that it actually inactivates bacteria and viruses. And so that is a kind of the chocolate on the pillow, if you will, of indoor air quality, in that it doesn't impact measurable indoor air quality necessarily, because obviously we're not able to measure mold, germs, or viruses in the air. Or we can, but not very cost effectively, because those sensors are very expensive. But it's important in that it can mitigate whatever's left that's floating around within that space. So, essentially, what does UV do? Well, UV actually breaks down the DNA of the viruses and the microorganisms, that it literally inactivates their ability to reproduce. And so when I was speaking earlier about the ability to actually clean an airstream, that all is relative to time and intensity, and that gives you the kill rate. So the longer the exposure to UV and the higher the intensity of the UV, the more bacteria, germs, etc., you can inactivate. And so if you have an airstream where you have a lot of UV light, you could inactivate the stuff that's floating through there. But you can also apply those, like I said, to coils, and you can even deploy these within spaces. We sold a job in Phoenix, or a large training center, where they were concerned about large numbers of folks coming in there through the course of the day. And so in between classroom training sections, they actually deployed UV battens within the space that with integrated door mechanism and indicator lights and sensors and whatnot to ensure nobody was in the room, those UV lights turn on and actually inactivate whatever might be floating around or on the surfaces of that specific room, chairs, keyboards, mics, etc. So UV has been around for a long time and is very effective in inactivating those devices. So it's a good complement to filtration when you're looking at a whole solution. And the nice thing about this is that it's been widely established. Academia and independent research in ASHRAE recommend UV light. It's a proven technology. It's not Johnny-come-lately trunk slammer kind of technology. It's been around a long time, and it works because a lot of scientific studies have shown and proven to be very effective in what it does. And again, this is kind of a picture of what installation might look like across a set of coils. And that's what I have. Any questions, comments, concerns about what we talked about today?
I have a question in regards to UV. I know that I've looked at potentially putting that throughout several of our sites here within my organization, one of the things that we ran into, why the technology is proven it works, the pricing of the application was somewhat challenging. Can you guys speak to that? You know, from a manufacturing standpoint, has that improved, or are we still looking at roughly the same pricing?
It in terms of availability has improved. Obviously, during the pandemic, the last 2 years, there was a very high demand and limited quantities. You had high lead times or long lead times to get these. I'm not sure necessarily what effect that has had now that has somewhat diminished in terms of pricing. But you're right. It can be, depending on how you're deploying it can be a little cost prohibitive sometimes. When we spec and design these systems, obviously they include certain safeguards and interlocks so that we're not risking personnel being exposed to that, because it can obviously cause temporary eye damage, skin irritation, etc. So some of that includes safety interlocks, portholes to view what's going on. There's obviously electrical associated with the installation. So yes, it can be a little challenging in terms of pricing, but that's the unfortunately one of the side effects of that is that it does require that intensity. So our system, we have an estimating tool that you enter the different parameters and it gives you the need for what those are. So it's not a guesstimate, and maybe that might be something to consider. Is that I know some again what I affectionately refer to as trunk slammers out there have kind of flooded the market, and so profit was the primary concern for them at that point. So we'd be happy to entertain some of that. Maybe have a quick cost comparison of what you're looking at.
Yeah, and I would say also, do you guys do installation on pre-existing systems? I'm imagining that you do with the UV.
Certainly, yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, and that's primarily where we ran into a lot of challenges. You know, was with existing. I think new design and build out is one thing, and you can factor that in, and that works out. But I think it's when you have an existing system and trying to modify what you have existing to accommodate UV sometimes can be challenging.
It can, and the largest component of that, of course, is the electrical installation. Depending on, essentially you're installing a ballast. These are like fluorescent fixtures. The nice thing about these is that they're magnetic mount, so that reduces the installation cost. And it's a lot quicker than having to bolt on a bunch of stuff. But yes, the electrical installation, especially in retrofit applications, depending on what's available, if you're and how big the air handlers are, of course, is going to determine the number of tubes you need, the number of ballasts, and of course that's going to determine the number of circuits that you might need, either existing or dedicated for that power. So that definitely is an issue.
Have you ever put a UV or know of anyone who's put a UV on evaporative cooling systems before?
I've not heard that. Certainly, you could look at that. I think you'd have some challenges in terms of the efficacy of the UV light, because of course, UV systems, you're propagating moisture and particulate into the air. And so I think that might be a maintenance challenge in keeping those tubes and even the life of those tubes. The other thing is that, of course, UV can degrade certain materials, components, filters, cell deck perhaps. And so exposing a lot of those things to UV light might be problematic.
Right. Yeah, great point.
Let's just change out all your evap coolers. Pat?
Easy enough. If I can get a check, if I can stroke you a check for a few million, that would be
blank
an easy
check.
job, right?
Right.
Well, appreciate it. Thank you. That was a wealth of information. So really appreciate that.
You're welcome.